Hello, and welcome to this final deep dive for the last 900 or so lines of the poem Beowulf. And the temptation here is to offer sort of my interpretation of things. I think it's an occupational hazard sometimes to do that. I'm struck this time reading through Beowulf by how many questions I have when the poem ends. I feel the same, frankly, at the end of any epic poem. The Iliad, the Odyssey, Paradise Lost in some way. But definitely with Beowulf. And so what I've done is offered some questions that I think are good, fruitful questions to discuss in reading groups or classes, or possibly to write about. First, and I stole this question from author Zadie Smith, who you should all check out. What does this poem think? What does this poem believe? And then maybe equally importantly, in what interesting ways does the poem change what it thinks and believes? If you think about in the Bible, in the New Testament, in the early Gospels, like Mark and Matthew, Jesus was understood in a certain way. His resurrection was understood in a certain way. In fact, it says Jesus was risen from the dead. God was the vehicle of that. Decades later, John wrote Jesus rose from the dead. There was an evolution of the idea of who this Jesus was and what he was able to do. And I think that sort of evolution that we see in scripture, I think we see in really great books, all great books. And I think there's a really good chance that the poem evolves and it isn't just like one stagnant set of conclusions or beliefs. So here are a few things the poem seems to really believe or care about, because these themes, questions, and issues repeat themselves over and over. First, it has nothing to do with cookies, but how should I deal with monsters? Obviously, there's three literal monsters. I would argue there's many figurative monsters, which hopefully are the ones that we all deal with, because, I don't know, I live in a dragon-free neighborhood, fortunately. But do we deal with monsters like Hrothgar's men did before Beowulf arrived? Give up, right? Surrender, realize that there are no superheroes here and we can't deal with them. Do we fight them directly? What are the options when confronted with an almost supernatural antagonist? Secondly, one of the most relevant issues that I think epic poetry deals with, and Beowulf specifically deals with, is the notion of cyclical violence. Guilt was obviously meant to curb the idea of needless violence, but the fact of the matter is we see this on the news all the time. There's an act of violence against somebody, vengeance is taken, there's more violence, on and on and on. I think the idea of cyclical violence is equally important in the digressions in the poem, like the Finnsburg fragment. And those digressions almost serve as like a parallel set of text, sort of thematically echoing off the primary narrative, because all the issues are the same. It's almost like we're just reminded, the story doesn't change. I wonder what the poem would say if the poem is an ultimate statement about stopping cyclical violence, or is the poem a little more fatalistic, surrendering to the idea that, cyclical violence is part of being human in a human community, unfortunately. And perhaps maybe the most we can hope for is temporary peace in the hands of a superhero. A lot is made, as a high school teacher, a lot is made in my world, and probably in yours too, if you're in the business world, a lot is made of this good leadership, right? Obviously, there's a lot about Beowulf that has nothing to do with good leadership now, but good leadership, good kingship early in the poem is defined as primarily a king who protects his people and is generous with them. And I think that evolves. There's other elements added to that throughout the poem, things kings can't do, even like the emotional landscape of a king, I think evolves in an interesting way. What does this poem think about this question? I think is worth talking about. One of the world's most important questions: how do I get to live forever? Is it through some sort of Christian salvation? Is it through a poet historian in my tribe singing my tale forever? And I think a lot of people now ask this question, right? But the poem kind of bounces back and forth between these two things in an interesting way. Second question: is this poem relevant? I think this is a trap question that teachers, and I know I've fallen into this trap, can almost preemptively ask this question before actually entering into the text authentically. Here's what I mean. I think it's easy to underestimate students' ability to enter into imaginative spaces that completely aren't relevant. So let me throw this out. My son, when he was in 8th, 9th grade, was obsessed with the show The Office. He was 13 years old, living in his bedroom. Really nothing in his life resembled The Office, but for whatever reason, he just loved being in that space. And if you think of a lot of the video games, kids play, superficially anyway, they're utterly foreign, utterly fantasy based. So I think entering into the text and taking it at its own merits is our first job, not proving its relevance over and over again, because that way you're kind of constantly looking for, autobiography in everything you read, and then what's the point? So I think one thing that Headley does in her translation really well is reflects on the limits of gender stereotypes, both the male gender, if men are supposed to be suicidally loyal to their king and enact vengeance when they're wronged, etc. What are the limits? What is the end result of that? If everybody is on board with that idea, what does the world look like? That's an interesting question. Female stereotypes, obviously Wealthiau being a really good queen, Modrith being a terrible queen. And then you have the sort of gender fluid Grendel's mother character, and that's another layer of what's fascinating. The theology of the poem, a lot of ink is spilled. There's an article, The Essential Paganism of Beowulf. There's many articles on the Christian elements of Beowulf. And I think a lot of scholars try to pin down sort of the theological commitments of the poem. And I don't think that's what's interesting. I think the director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, Barton, I forget his first name, is John Barton. When an actor would say, geez, I'm not sure whether to play this character's passion for his wife or his commitments to the government, and that I don't know which to choose, Barton would always say to actors, play the tension between those two things. And I think it's really liberating when you're reading the work of literature to try not to draw conclusions. I think one of the dangers of writing a lot of analytical essays and being a student is to make works of literature into philosophical treatises. The job of this is to enact a human drama, not to draw clear, distinct conclusions about things, even though the characters would probably want clear, distinct conclusions. So the theology of the poem, I would argue, is syncretistic. In other words, it embodies multiple theologies. So the example historically that's interesting is King Redwald, who's the king whose hoard was buried at Sutton Hoo, we think. On his altar, he had a statue of the Norse god of war, Tyr, the one-handed god, and a cross. That's syncretism. And I just think as I read Beowulf, this is a people who is sort of going back and forth between what it believes, very early days of Christianity in Northern Europe. So, and I think it's easy to judge them as simplistic or kind of dark ages. But I don't know. I know a lot of people who go to church. I go to church, but there's moments where I'm quite materialistic or selfish. I know people who are very faith-filled who also get their palms read and their fortunes told. So I think a lot of us dip our toes into various belief systems, sort of whether we realize it or not. And I think that's in the poem as well. And then something that comes up at almost every workshop teachers go to now is, the marginalized, paying attention to the marginalized. And I think it's often presumed that books like Beowulf can't do that because they're old. But, Grendel's mother doesn't have a name. That matters. Grendel's mother doesn't have a voice. That matters. She's wronged, but is supposed to not do anything about it because of her gender. That matters. And the Geat woman at the end, her importance I'll get to later. But asking the question when you're reading any book, who's not talking? Who have I not heard from? It's sort of like when you're a teacher and there are quiet, thoughtful kids in the class and you ask them to share. You can do that with literary characters too. What would this character say, do you think? So I think that's really important. And then just like now, I don't think anybody wants to be irrelevant. I think whether it's an immortal life or at least a sense that my life had a purpose, I think the Anglo-Saxon poems have a really keen sense of that, perhaps because life was really tenuous. But they just had a really sophisticated sense of the relationship between how we think and behave now and then how we might live on beyond our death. Third question, is Beowulf a good king or a good man? When I teach the Odyssey, many of my freshmen acknowledge Odysseus as the hero and acknowledge that they hate him. I don't think Beowulf engenders as much hate. He's not a trickster in the same way and a liar like Odysseus is, and that's interesting. But there are debates to be had about whether Beowulf is a good king. There are debates to be had as to whether Beowulf is a good man. I just put this out there. Why do you think Beowulf doesn't have a wife and children? I think that's a really curious absence in a world where everybody is the son of so and so. Why is it important that his people aren't safe at the end? So just some things to consider. And this is a default question teachers ask. I think it's really an important question. Unless you're a Geatish superhero who's defeated monsters and dragons, you're not like Beowulf, at least superficially. So something that I really care about as a teacher and as someone who's led reading groups is how can people from the other side of the world, from a millennia away, enter into this space personally and to enter into this universe personally. And for me, because I've lost my father somewhat recently, the last couple of times I've read Beowulf, the father-son dynamic is really interesting. Hrothgar sort of adopting Beowulf was really moving to me in a different way. And even the constant mentioning that Beowulf is Bearn Ecgtheow, son of Ecgtheow, he can't escape that. And I've often thought of, my dad's relevance in my life beyond his death. And it's similar to that. So if I were to answer this question, I would talk about the idea of fathers and sons and legacy. Think about ways you can personally relate. And then last but not least, and I love this question, does this poem end with a sense of hope? Or what does the Geat woman's final lament do to our reading of the poem? I think if you take the Geat woman's paragraph out, what we have at the end is Wiglaf saying positive things about Beowulf. We have a noble death, Wiglaf saying positive things about Beowulf, the poet saying positive things about Beowulf, the messenger saying positive things about Beowulf, and an incredibly opulent, lavish, incredible pagan funeral, the end. The problem is this mentioning of a nameless, also voiceless woman who laments out loud, and it isn't disagreed with by the poet, by the way. No one disagrees with this woman's lament. I think that's important. The poet has no problem judging people in the poem. The poet doesn't judge the Geat woman. And it's that because Beowulf is dead, that other communities will invade and destroy them. And because this man felt the need to be heroic one more time, justified or not, she's doomed. Her safety is reliant on that man's choices. So I think a lot of ink can be spilled, a lot of good conversations about this question. Anyway, these are just some questions for consideration after finishing. I would be really curious about your thoughts of any of these questions, or what big questions do you have after reading the poem? Please comment in the YouTube comments section. I'd love to hear from you. Good luck with your reading.